Good day, Bsse2, and welcome to our online sync in our course Asian Studies. Today, we're going to talk about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So, how it begins, what are the reasons or causes, why up until today we are having and we are receiving news coming from the international body that Israel and Palestine are still in conflict. Actually, they've had several wars. For whatever reason, that's what we're going to talk about. Okay. Without further ado, let me open and share to you my screen in order for us to start our lesson. Okay. Let me present now. And let me open my slides. All right. Let me open it up. And then let me maximize this one. Okay, so what we're going to talk now is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the historical context. So we'll take a look at how it begins and what were the reasons why up until today these two countries are having political turmoil and at the same time having actually fought in several wars. Okay, as you can see from the pictures, there are a lot of movements, a lot of resistance between the two countries, and apparently there are a lot of death tolls counted by both countries because of this conflict, and that's what we're going to talk about. So our focus is who has a better claim to the land. Now the question, who has a better claim for the land, is that Israel and Palestine are actually claiming the land in which both of them are actually situated right now. Okay, who has a better claim to the land? Why should we study actually Israel and Palestine conflict? Why we need to understand this conflict? Because at some point it actually created the ripple effect that this conflict has created several, shall we say, an alter ego, which establishes terrorist groups that causes not only problems in both countries, but also it actually reaches beyond their borders, going to the West and also in the United States. And at some point, it influences other militant groups to create a faction that resembles a resistance against, from what we believe as a resistance towards Israel. Okay? So that is one of the main reasons why we need to understand it. Okay, so there are many injuries, deaths, and resulted from this conflict over land and religion over the past 60 years. And the violence continues today. All right. So again, we need to study the conflict between Israel and Palestine because for the past 60 years, we have been receiving reports coming from these countries that they are actually in turmoil and they are fighting one another for a claim of a parcel of a land in the Middle East, where both the Jews and the Arab people are trying to get or trying actually to claim who has the rightful claim of this land. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, until this problem is solved, terrorist groups continue to use it as a rallying cry, just like what I said, against the West, which includes the United States. Okay, as long as we kept on having this conflict between Israel and Palestine, it actually creates, a different perception, and it created a rallying cry for other militant group to establish, especially a terrorist group that creates havoc towards another countries, not just in the Middle East alone, but also it far reaches to the West, in the Europe, and also in the United States. Not like and it does not limit only with the West. It also included some parts of Asia. If you remember, we have had a problem with terrorist groups. It all started at the very beginning of Duterte's administration, right? Back in 17, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it was 2017, 2016. Yeah, probably 2017. Yeah, around that time. I forgot the exact date, but we have the conflict, the Marawi siege, right? And apparently, we've seen ISIS militant groups who are rallying and occupying Marawi city. And that is one thing that we have to acknowledge why we have to study the conflict between Israel and Palestine, because at some point it has roots to this kind of problem. Though we are not limiting it only to these countries, but there are also parts of the Middle East who have been the cradle of some terrorist groups who inflicted quite a lot of trouble, not only in their country, but also towards another country in the planet. Okay? So where is Israel and Palestine? All right, so it is located in the Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East. If you can see this one, the yellow one is actually part now of Israel. This one, the West Bank, is occupied by the Palestinian, and this one is the Gaza Strip. This one here is the Gaza Strip, and this one is the West Bank. These are two of the tiny parcel of land where the Palestinian are occupying, and this one, the yellow one, is actually the country of Israel. Now, Jerusalem is declared as an international city or an international place. That's And if you can see, we have Egypt, we have Jordan. These are actually the neighboring countries lying in the country of Israel and Palestine. We also have Lebanon and we have Syria. And at some point, there was a time that Israel and Egypt had a conflict and actually Egypt tried to occupy Israel, Jordan as well. We have also Syria and Lebanon. Okay, so these are the countries who actually tried to push back Israel, especially during the time that Israel just occupied the place that we know now as Israel. Because prior to 1,000 years ago, this land has become the land of the Arabs, especially with the Palestinians. Okay, all right. Now, the Palestinian and Israeli propaganda maps. Israeli map lumping together the Arab states, depicting tiny defenseless Israel. So this one. All right. So this one, actually, Israel is being surrounded with all of the Arab states that could potentially inflict a terrible attack or probably an aggression towards the country. Again, we all know one possible reason is that Israel just occupied basically the land of Palestinians as what the Palestinians wanted. All right. So up until today, it's very confusing who really owns the land, because both have the right of the land as part of legal matters would tell us. Okay. But there's an intervention of international policy that created a much more conflict. But we'll go to that deeper. Okay. This is a Palestinian map without Israel. As you can see, Palestine actually occupies the entire country. But if we can look at now the map of this land here, it's basically we have the West Bank where the Palestinian is actually residing, and some strip, the Gaza Strip here, which is occupied also with or by the Palestinian. Okay. Okay. So the differences between the two. So of course, Israeli, they call their countries Israel, and the Palestinian just located and occupies the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israelis are multi-ethnic, so there are European, Middle Eastern, newer Russian, Ethiopian immigrants. Because again, there was this diaspora that the Jewish people were actually spread out all throughout the world until they were given the opportunity to settle in a place where they call now as Israel. Of course, we have Arab-Israeli minority situated in the country. For the Palestinians, they have Arab ethnic territoriality because they believe that 1,000 years ago, after the diaspora, Palestine is the land of the Arabs. So Palestinians are also multi-religious. They have Muslims and Christians as well living in the area. Also, they have ethnic nationalist movement. These are some of the minorities in Palestinians who are also trying to get a glimpse or trying to to give us or show us an idea that the country is not only for the Muslims and the Christians, but there are also ethnic minorities who were residing in Palestine that wasn't given much of attention. So that's why they have this kind of movement. Okay. All right. So the question: why is this land the center of controversy? Again, the first question was, who actually have the claim for that land? Now, why it is the center of controversy? So let's talk about it. All right, so there are currently two national groups who are claiming the rightful ownership of this territory. We have the Israelis, or the Israelites, or the Jews, and the Palestinians. Now, most Israelis are Jews, correct? Most Palestinians are Muslims. So there are two conflicting, not just with nationality, but also with religion as well, right? Of course, Judaism are practiced by the Jews, and Islam is practiced by the Muslims. Also, both countries have residents who are Christians as well. Okay. Now, many Jews have long claimed the connection to this holy land, believing that it was a promise to the ancient Hebrew by God. So it was actually the promised land, right? If you remember, if you can recall your religious studies, you'd probably know that God has promised the Israelites to have to find the promised land after their diaspora, right? And the Jews believe that the land that they are right now, which they call as Israel, is the promised land. However, moving on, these Jews believe that despite the fact that they suffered a diaspora scattered around the world due to invasions, the land of Palestine is ultimately theirs. This one. All right. So this is actually the map of the not the world, but between Europe and Asia, especially Middle East. So this is the routes of the diaspora of the Jewish people. Okay. Now, despite these historical claims, many Muslim Palestine argue that this land belongs to them, as the region has been predominantly Muslim for over 1,000 years since the Jewish diaspora. So what did the Jews expect that they would receive a homeland? Now, in 1917, there was a declaration in Balfour, statement by the British government that advocated for the creation of Israel. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. So the Balfour Declaration states that there should be a nation where all of the Jewish people can actually reunite and then establish their own statehood. It is because for thousands of years, they have been dispersed all throughout the world. It doesn't even have a place there where they can call it as a homeland, right? But during this declaration in Balfour, the British people, the British government actually considers it, okay? So, of course, the question is, why did Jews feel that they needed a homeland? Nga naman. Let's talk about it. Now, anti-Semitism extremely common in virtually all Jewish diaspora destinations. When we talk about anti-Semitism, basically anti-Jews, meaning all of their lives, the Jewish people were subjected to discrimination. To some point, this discrimination led to, if you recall, the World War II led to a genocide of this race, right? When Hitler actually ordered that these people should be exterminated because of all the people in the world, these are the most vicious and vile people. That's what Hitler believed in, right? But apart from that, thousands of years ago, they have been persecuted. In Egypt, they have been persecuted. In Middle East, they have been persecuted, right? So this anti-Semitism activities that the Jewish people have experienced is one of the many reasons why the British government believe that this has to stop and we have to acknowledge the existence of this race. It is because they are part of the human race, right? So the anti-Jewish violence and discrimination have occurred all throughout the world. Say, for example, these are some of the examples that had been written in our textbooks and history books, where we can talk about how they have been persecuted, right? In 70 Common Era, Roman Empire destroys Jerusalem temple. 1348 CE, 900 Jewish burned to death as suspects in causing or spreading the bubonic plague in Starsbro. Can you imagine? You have been suspected without even a trial, without even proper evidences that can prove that this entire populace of the Jewish people are actually the cause of the bubonic plague. But during this time, they have been persecuted, around 900 of them. Okay? Now, in 1543, even Martin Luther writes One of the Jews and Their Lies, a fiercely anti-Semitic work. So these are some of the agony and sufferings of the Jewish people all throughout their history. And this have been their ground in trying to find a homeland where they can defend, they can worship, they can practice, and they can live peacefully on their own. But it did take a long time for them to really find it. And they needed help from other countries, especially with their allies, in order for them to establish it. All right, just like what I said, the Holocaust, right? It's a genocide over the Jewish race. So many of this, you already know, there are camps, there are people who were burned to death through torches. Of course, mass executions. They just been, targeted over and over again. So these are some of the most agonizing and most terrifying experiences of the Jewish race, especially during the World War II. Now, in response to these historical connections and events, the United Nations decides to create a Jewish homeland. So it was until 1947 when the Great Britain, which controlled the region then known as the British Palestine, turned the land over to the United Nations, which decided to allow these groups to divide the land between them. So, of course, during the time where the Great Britain just recently won World War II and has control over the land of Palestine, they were able to establish an idea. You know what? It is right time now for the people of, for the Jewish people to be given a land where they can claim it as their own, where they can actually live and they can actually, gather all of the people. We call that initiative as Zionism, right? Calling all the Jewish people going to the place of what they call as the promised land. Okay. All right. So again, you can see the Arab state is the yellow one, and then the Jewish state. But as of today, if you can recall the previous pictures or map that I presented to you, the Palestinian just got a very small parcel of land, because eventually the land that was given to Israelites, they kept on continuing claiming and claiming. That's why the Palestinians were just left with the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Okay. So another question is, why did the UN decide to partition this land in 1947? All right. Just like what I said, the movement called Zionism became active in Europe in the late 1800s. It's the desire to create a Jewish homeland, which is called Israel in the British Palestine area. So this one. Okay, until such time, Jerusalem were able to occupy quite a lot of places of the former Palestine. And what was left to the Palestinian people were the Gaza Strip again and the West Bank. So what are the immediate effects of this partition of 1947? Israel declares independence as a new country in 1948 and is immediately attacked by its Arab neighbors because the Arab people, especially neighboring countries just like Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, backed the Palestinian because they were close neighbors and they really don't have conflict at that time at all, before the Jewish people claimed some of the lands of the Palestinians, right? So they backed the Palestinians in order for the Jewish people to, to push out again from the promised land they called. However, up until today, the Palestinians do not recognize Israel and therefore do not declare an Arab country called Palestine, right? What happened was after the attacks coming from Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and even Syria, of course, they weren't successful, right? Jewish people were able to fight back and actually tried to slowly occupy almost all of what was left in the Palestinian land, right? Until such time that Israel grew stronger, were able to establish military defense systems, and they were able to get as much as military power that they can get after World War II. They were able to defend themselves properly. And then there are several attempts of these Arab nations to occupy the country, but they were unsuccessful, of course. One example is that when Egypt and Israel fought hard for whatever reason in trying to occupy the Gaza Strip, what happened was is that in order to maintain peace, Israel and in Egypt actually signed a peace pact. Israel just gave away a Gaza Strip in order to appease what was happened or what had happened in the past between the two countries. Okay? So ilang gihatag ang Gaza Strip as part of the peace pact. So wala na nila gi-occupy. Because at that time, war will not really halt because both countries wanted to get a parcel of what they're claiming. Okay? So what were the consequences in 1948 for an Arab-Israeli war? So Israel successfully defended itself and seizes more territory. Correct. Only two disconnected regions, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, remained unoccupied as future Palestine. So this one. Okay, I've already talked about this one. So Palestinian refugees lose homes and land. Can you imagine? There were at least 50% of the Palestinian were given to Israel, 50% to the Palestinian. But over time, Israel kept on moving forward. Of course, since they have been attacked by several Arab neighboring countries, no. What happened was, as Israel defended and successfully won wars between the Arabs, they've eventually occupied more and more lands of what was Palestine before. What was left again with the Palestinian is the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which up until now they are claiming that that is not the only land that they have. That all of Israel is basically part of the Palestine. So another result is, or consequences, Palestinian extremists become furious at Israel occupation of what was supposed to be the Arab country of Palestine. Because of this extremism, there were quite a lot of terroristic attacks, or not terroristic attacks, but actually nationalistic attacks between from Palestine. They kept on trying, to claim the land that they used to live. So some of them are actually going further from war and committed suicides. There are people who are involved in suicide bombings. So Israelis know that they must defend themselves with military force. They will not wait to be attacked again. So that's the comment of the Israelis between the Arab attempt on occupying back Palestine, or what was Palestine. Israel asserts its claim over the city of Jerusalem, but of course, the UN and the rest of the international organization would like to assume that Jerusalem is actually part of an international city where everybody can go there and worship, right? Israeli extremists are easily be able to use the war as evidence for rightness of the Israeli cause. Long-term consequences after 1948-49. In 1967, Israel's Arab neighbors planned to annihilate the Jewish state, but Israel strikes first, easily defeating the Arab nations. They then occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. Sinai Peninsula was also given to Egypt after both prime ministers signed a peace pact. Okay. The war in 1967, known as the Six-Day War. Now, Israel maintains control over two of these controversial regions, West Bank and the Golan Heights. But eventually, West Bank was fully occupied by the Palestinians. Or that's what we know, right? So these are the examples that I've shown you earlier, okay? So 1922, 1948, if you can see this map, as you can see, it is occupied entirely by the Palestinian people, right? There's no Israel yet, though. In 1917, there was a declaration of Balfour of the intention of providing the Jewish people a land, right? But it wasn't until 1947, during the British attempt to give a partition of land to the Jewish people, when the British Empire gave the right to the UN, to provide Jewish people a land. So as you can see, from this one, you'll be able to see that the Gaza Strip was actually quite huge at that time, was left to the Palestinian, same a land near to the West Bank and northern part of this area. And then the Jewish state is this one. But after 1948-1949 war, where Arab nations, neighboring countries attacked Israel, they then kept on defending their country, of course, and then eventually won the fight between the Arab and Israelis. So what happened was, what was left to the Palestinian is the green zone, right? But up until this time, the green zone is in between Israel and the Palestinian and the Arab nations, like Jordan, and the Palestinian. So Jerusalem is in between two conflicting countries at this moment. After which, in 1967 war, when it's the Six-Day War, they won. What happened? Of the West Bank, most of the places were actually occupied by Israel because they kept on winning during the war, or that war in 1967. Okay. So the holy city of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, we call it as Jerusalem. All throughout history, this place has been known for several attempts of occupying and trying to understand who basically owns this place. Because as you can notice in history, the Jewish people claim this one, and then the Muslims also, and then the Christians. Of course, the Muslims and Christians had several attempts of gaining control of this place. If you can recall, we have crusades, several crusades that we can present on an evidence that this country is basically very significant religiously and politically for both nations who are trying to occupy Jerusalem, right? Okay, so this is the map. As you can see, west, we have Israeli. We have the Christians, we have the Armenian quarter, we have the Muslim quarter, we have the Jewish quarter. Okay. Now, Israeli settlements and Palestinian towns in the West Bank. This is in 2000. So Israeli settlers see a historic Jewish homeland. Palestinians compare illegal settlement to apartheid. If you recall apartheid in South Africa. So that's what the Palestinians felt during the time when, of course, Israelis tries to to occupy almost all of what is left now for the Palestinian people. Okay. Okay. I think this is the slides, all of the discussions. Um, of course, there are a lot of things that happened in our history that at some point has a lot of connotations or relationships with what was happening in the Middle East, right? Um, Influences from both countries actually had a lot of causes that disrupts some of our common issues today, right? Up until today, we are still having problems of terrorism. At some point, terroristic activities have sprouted to probably an equal treatment, most specifically when people claims a land um, who basically there are also people who are living there and claiming at the same time, right? um, if I'm going to leave you a question, who do you think really have the right to own the land where Palestine and Israel are trying to claim? That's the biggest question here. I have given you and presented you the history of the conflict. If Israel have the right because of the persecutions that they have experienced all throughout the history, um, after they have been in diaspora, then is it really rightful that they will be occupying a place where there are already a country existed, a state existed called the Palestine, right? So again, these are two conflicting issues. It's going to be you to think and decide who really have the right or claim of the land. But most significant, probably, the learning that I might um, that it's basically a takeaway is that there's really no good thing that would happen if things are going to be resolved with war. Up until today, there are children, civilians who are suffering because of war, between of political ideology, probably religious ideology, things like that. Okay, up until we have we won't really share a thing in our planet, then this would really create and cause a lot of sufferings, a lot of pain to the people, even after maybe centuries from now. As long as we do think that way, still we would be having this kind of problem. All right. So that is our discussion between the conflict of Israel and Palestine. I hope you have understood something from this discussion, part of Asian studies. I'm hoping that next meeting we'll be able to see one another before the final. So don't forget to please do your projects now, do a little bit of readings, because your finals is nearing. And also, there's still modules that I'll be giving you, but we may stop on module 10 for all of the activities. But module 11, module 12, though, you will not submit activities, but that will still be part of the entire module of this term. Part of it is that you should be reading because it's part of the exam. Okay. All right, BSSC2, thank you for listening. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask me. Maybe just comment below or directly ask me to my messenger. I'll try to find time to answer you. Okay. All right. See you. Have a good day.